The unforgiving peaks of the Sierra Nevada, shrouded in a perpetual hush of pine and granite, had long been home to Elias Thorne. At 38, his face was a tapestry of sun-baked lines and the occasional ash smudge, testaments to a life spent battling the relentless wildfires that scorched the national forests he so fiercely protected. He was a man carved from the very landscape around him, rugged, resilient, and solitary. His cabin, a sturdy log structure nestled deep within a particularly remote valley, stood as a fortress against the world, a world that had, over the past 4 years, sent him no less than 9 women, each more bewildered than the last. 9 hopeful mail-order brides, none of whom had lasted beyond 72 hours in his austere domain. The agency, Mountain Heart's Match, had assured him each time that this one was different, yet the dust from the departing wagon always told the same story. Another empty chair at his rough-hewn table, another flicker of disappointment in his usually stoic eyes. Elias wasn't looking for companionship in the conventional sense. He needed a partner, a strong hand to help manage the small self-sustaining farm that provided his existence when the fire season quieted, and a steady presence in the vast silence that often pressed in. His previous brides, mostly from bustling cityscapes, had withered under the sheer weight of isolation, the endless chores and the daunting grandeur of the wilderness. They had arrived with romanticized notions of mountain living, only to be confronted by the brutal reality of hauling water from the well, chopping firewood in the biting cold, and the profound absence of neighbors. He'd tried to be understanding, had explained the rhythms of his life, but their eyes, accustomed to streetlights and chatter, saw only an insurmountable emptiness. Each departure left a fresh scar on his quiet hope, hardening his resolve to remain alone, even as the longing for a shared life lingered like the scent of distant smoke. This time, however, the correspondence from Mountain Heart's Match had a different tone. Loretta Jenkins, the agency's owner, a woman whose voice sounded like crushed velvet over the crackling phone line, had spoken of a candidate named Clara Bellwether. "Elias," Loretta had cooed, her voice tinged with an unusual certainty. "Clara is robust. She understands hard work, comes from a farming family in Ohio, and has a resilience you won't believe. She's 31, a little older than your usual preferences, but trust me, this one is different." Elias had grunted, a skeptical sound that rumbled deep in his chest. "They all say that, Loretta," but there was something in Loretta's conviction, a quiet assurance that nudged him to agree. Clara would arrive in mid-October, just before the first heavy snowfalls threatened to seal the valley off entirely. The day of her arrival dawned crisp and clear, the autumn air sharp with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. Elias, despite his cynicism, found himself pacing the dirt path leading to his cabin. He'd spent the morning cleaning, a task he usually only undertook with reluctance, ensuring the small living space was as welcoming as his rough hands could make it. He'd even baked a simple apple pie, a rare concession to domesticity that felt strangely vulnerable. As the lumbering supply truck, driven by old Jebediah, finally rumbled into view, a cloud of dust blooming behind it, Elias felt a familiar knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. He watched as the truck sputtered to a halt, and Jebediah, a grizzled man with a permanent squint, hopped down. Then the passenger door creaked open. Out stepped Clara. Loretta had called her robust. Elias thought formidable was a more accurate descriptor. She wasn't merely overweight, she was substantial, a woman whose presence filled the space around her. Her deep crimson dress, though well-made, stretched taut across her generous frame, and her dark chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical no-nonsense bun. But it was her eyes that truly caught him, a startling shade of hazel, intelligent and direct, meeting his gaze without flinching. There was no terror, no immediate judgment, none of the wide-eyed fear that had characterized the previous women. Instead, there was an almost disconcerting calm, an unreadable stillness that intrigued and unsettled him. She looked at him, at his rugged face, his calloused hands, the wild, untamed land behind him, and simply nodded. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice surprisingly soft but firm, carrying a faint, pleasant cadence he couldn't quite place. "Clara Bellwether. I assume you're Elias." Her hand, surprisingly delicate for a woman of her build, extended towards him. Elias, momentarily flustered, took it. Her grip was strong, not timid. "That's right," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. Jebediah, accustomed to these awkward introductions, quickly began unloading her trunk and a few sturdy boxes. Clara didn't wait for direction. She immediately began to sort through her belongings, her movements surprisingly agile for her size. She produced a small leather-bound journal and a well-worn copy of Walden, placing them carefully on her trunk. As Jebediah departed, his truck's roar fading into the vast quiet, an immense silence descended. Elias gestured awkwardly towards the cabin. "Come in, Clara. I made pie." It was a clumsy offering, a peace treaty extended by a man unaccustomed to such gestures. Clara merely smiled, a genuine, warm expression that momentarily softened the stern lines of her face. "Thank you, Elias. That's very kind." Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center, and a small cot in the corner that would serve as her bed. Clara surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on the flickering flames in the hearth. "Cozy," she observed, her tone devoid of sarcasm. Elias watched her, a prickle of unease mixed with a sliver of cautious hope. She hadn't screamed, hadn't cried, hadn't demanded to be taken back. She simply was. The first few days were a quiet, almost watchful dance. Elias, accustomed to women who recoiled from manual labor, found himself constantly surprised. Clara didn't ask what needed doing. She simply observed and then acted. She organized his chaotic pantry with a precision that bordered on art, stacking jars of preserves and bags of flour with military efficiency. She found his pile of mending, an assortment of worn denim and flannel, and within an hour had transformed it into a neat stack of repaired clothing, the stitches even and strong. She took to the outdoor pump with a determined stride, hauling buckets of water without complaint, her breath puffing in the crisp morning air. She chopped kindling with an easy, rhythmic swing, the axe head biting cleanly into the wood. Elias often caught himself simply watching her, mesmerized by her sheer competence, her quiet resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, Elias sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar. Clara emerged carrying 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea she'd brewed from dried leaves she'd brought. She sat beside him, the old wooden bench groaning slightly under her weight, but holding firm. "It's beautiful here, Elias," she said, her voice a soft murmur against the vast expanse of the valley. "So much sky." Elias grunted in agreement, a familiar sound that usually signaled the end of a conversation. But Clara didn't flinch. She simply sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, a serene expression on her face. He felt a strange urge to speak, to break the comfortable silence, but the words wouldn't come. He'd forgotten how to talk, truly talk, to someone. He only knew how to bark orders or offer monosyllabic responses, yet with Clara the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was simply quiet. By the end of the first week, a week that had seen 9 other women pack their bags and depart, Clara remained. She hadn't just endured, she had integrated. Her presence in the cabin felt less like an intrusion and more like a natural part of the environment. Elias found himself leaving notes for her. Firewood needs stacking, trap needs checking, and returning to find the tasks completed with meticulous care. He still felt guarded, a wall built from years of disappointment, but a small crack, a tiny fissure, was beginning to appear in its foundations. He hadn't dared to ask her why she stayed, fearing that if he acknowledged her presence too directly, it might somehow dissipate, like a mountain mist. But the question simmered beneath his surface, a low, persistent hum. What was it about Clara Bellwether that allowed her to thrive where so many others had failed? He looked at her one morning, bundled in a thick woolen coat, splitting logs with a steady rhythm, her face flushed with exertion, and knew with a sudden startling clarity that this was different. This woman wasn't afraid of the mountain. She wasn't even afraid of him. The fragile truce of the first week quickly solidified into a shared rhythm, a silent, efficient partnership that both Elias and Clara had been unconsciously craving. October surrendered to November, bringing a biting cold that made the air sting, and still, Clara remained. Elias, the solitary mountain firefighter, was gradually forced to dismantle the emotional barricades he had meticulously constructed over nearly a decade of solitude. He found himself leaving the cabin earlier to check the distant traps and returning later from scouting fire breaks, not because the work demanded it, but because he was subtly testing her resolve, waiting for the inevitable moment she would break and flee. But every evening the cabin was warm, smelling of savory stew and freshly baked bread. Clara had taken to baking with a ferocity that matched his own wood-chopping zeal. He learned that she used her substantial weight not as a hindrance but as leverage, a source of steady, grounded power in every physical task. One raw, wind-whipped afternoon, while they were stacking the season's final load of timber, Elias finally let the question escape the prison of his mind. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand, and looked at Clara, who was bracing a towering stack of logs with her shoulder. "Why haven't you left, Clara?" The bluntness of the question, stripped of all preamble, hung in the cold air. Clara paused, slowly setting down the last piece of pine, her breathing even. She didn't look away, fixing him with her intelligent hazel gaze. "Because the view is honest," she said simply, her voice low. "The women before me, they were looking for a rescue. They wanted the kind of husband who would whisk them away to an easier life, filled with delicate comforts. They wanted a storybook ending." She sighed, a puff of steam in the air. "I spent my life in a factory town, Elias. I know what struggle looks like. The men I met there were constantly pretending to be wealthier, stronger, or kinder than they were." She stepped toward him, closing the few feet that separated them, and the intimacy of the moment was palpable. "You, Elias Thorne, are exactly what you present yourself to be. A rough, quiet man who works hard, keeps his word, and doesn't waste energy on pretense. You told the agency the life here was brutal, isolated, and demanding, and it is. And I respect that honesty more than any flowery courtship letter." Elias felt a curious warmth spread through his chest, a sensation foreign to the chilly mountain air. It was the warmth of being truly seen. The conversation opened a necessary, if uncomfortable, chapter in their relationship. Over the next few weeks, they began to share pieces of their past, not through emotional confessionals, but through dry, factual recollections. Elias spoke of the horrific season, 4 years prior, when he lost 2 close colleagues to a sudden, devastating firestorm, an event that drove him further into self-imposed exile. He admitted that his solitude was not entirely a choice, but a penance for a sense of survivor's guilt that still gnawed at him. Clara, in turn, revealed that her father's small family farm, the place she had saved her entire life to buy, was lost to a predatory bank foreclosure shortly after her parents' deaths. "I didn't lose my way of life, Elias," she explained one night, kneading dough with strong, methodical movements. "I lost my purpose. I came here looking for a new purpose, not a vacation, and I'm not afraid of the fire, inside or out." One night, an unsettling new development occurred. A small but persistent fire broke out unexpectedly on the lower north slope of their valley. It was too late in the year for a natural cause. Someone was careless, or worse, malicious. Elias, the veteran firefighter, reacted instantly, his adrenaline spiking as the familiar dread took hold. He grabbed his gear, his face hardening into the grim mask of a man going to war. As he prepared to leave, Clara simply picked up a shovel and his heavy emergency pack, her movements purposeful. "I'm coming with you," she stated, her voice brooking no argument. Elias was about to snap a refusal, citing the sheer danger, but the memory of the previous women, cowering, hysterical, begging him not to leave them, stopped him. He saw only competence in Clara's eyes. He conceded, issuing sharp, concise instructions on safety and communication. Out on the dark, smoky slope, Clara proved invaluable. She didn't complain about the suffocating smoke or the grueling labor. She attacked the ground, digging a fire line with a tireless, driving strength that often outpaced him. She used her bulk to turn heavy, burning logs, her sturdy frame enduring the heat and strain. As the hours passed and they finally managed to contain the blaze, Elias looked at her covered in soot, her face streaked with sweat, and realized that she was not just his helpmate, she was his teammate. They had fought a small, terrifying battle together, and they had won. The shared experience, the primal struggle against a dangerous external force, forged a deeper, more profound connection than any shared conversation ever could. The next significant shift occurred when the first serious tension arose, centered not on external hardship, but on a deep-seated disagreement about their future. Clara, ever the planner, proposed installing a small rudimentary greenhouse, a necessity for survival, she argued, to diversify their food source and provide a buffer against the erratic mountain climate. Elias, focused on fire safety and immediate maintenance, dismissed the idea immediately. Too much effort for too little return, he grumbled, adhering to his belief in pure necessity. Clara, however, didn't retreat. For the first time, she stood her ground, her face flushing, not with anger but with conviction. Elias, survival is not just about avoiding death, it is about creating life. I did not come here merely to survive your long winter. I came to thrive, to build. You are so focused on waiting for the next disaster that you refuse to plan for prosperity. Her words hit him with the force of a falling timber. She had articulated the core of his post-trauma existence, a man trapped in a perpetual state of readiness for catastrophe. He watched her storm away to the root cellar, her heavy footsteps echoing his own internal turmoil. That night, the silence in the cabin was thick, oppressive, a stark contrast to their previous comfortable quiet. They slept in separate rooms, the physical distance mirroring the emotional chasm that had opened between them. But the very next morning, Elias, without a word, began clearing the area behind the cabin, the designated spot for the proposed greenhouse. Clara watched him from the window, and when he finally looked up, he saw the faint, pleased smile on her lips. They started the project together that day, the unspoken apology accepted, the partnership redefined. It would be a union of his practical necessity and her vision for growth. They were building a future together. The evolution of Elias and Clara's relationship, tested by fire, honest confrontation, and the shared vision of a greenhouse, marked the true turning point in their unlikely match. They were no longer two lonely individuals sharing space, but two halves of a whole united by mutual respect and a complementary set of skills. They had, in the heart of the unforgiving mountains, found something far more valuable than romance, an unshakable, practical love built on the foundation of shared work and brutal honesty. If you enjoy witnessing stories of resilience, unexpected connections, and the emotional power of finding true partnership in the most unlikely circumstances, please consider subscribing to the channel. We work hard to bring you narratives that challenge expectations and celebrate the strength of the human spirit. And now for your part. If you could choose one item to bring to a remote mountain cabin for the sole purpose of improving your partner's comfort, not survival, what would it be and why? Share your imaginative idea in the comments below. The harsh, demanding beauty of the Sierra Nevada entered a cycle of renewal. December melted into January, and the long, bitter cold of the high-altitude winter descended, sealing the valley with layers of heavy, silent snow. This period was the true climax of their shared journey, a time when the external world vanished completely, leaving only Elias and Clara inside the cabin, their survival dependent solely upon the strength of their foundation. For weeks on end, they saw nothing but the swirling white outside the small square windows, and heard only the relentless roar of the wind, punctuated by the sharp crack of freezing wood. The close confinement, which would have driven the previous women to hysterics, instead served to deepen the quiet intimacy Clara and Elias had cultivated. Elias, the man of action and movement, struggled with the forced inactivity. Clara, who had endured years of rhythmic, mind-numbing labor in a close-quartered textile mill, found a familiar comfort in the stillness. She occupied herself with projects that rooted them further to the land, cataloging their meticulously preserved provisions, creating intricate quilt patterns from scrap fabric, and spending hours with her journal, an act of intellectual reflection Elias had never witnessed firsthand. He watched her, fascinated by her ability to find peace and purpose in the narrow confines of their small world. He started carving again, an old, forgotten hobby, shaping blocks of pine into utilitarian but beautiful objects, a new ladle for the kitchen, a perfectly balanced handle for her small axe. It was an offering, a silent language of appreciation. One frigid evening, as the fire crackled low and the cabin was steeped in the scent of cedar and wood smoke, Clara spoke about her late husband, Thomas. "He was a kind man, Elias," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, her hands resting in her lap. "He died of consumption when I was 22. Our marriage lasted only 7 months. It was built on a fierce but ultimately fragile young love." She looked up, her gaze steady. "I realized then that passion is necessary, but it's not the structure. It's the paint. The structure needs to be made of competence, respect, and shared goals. I came here looking for a carpenter, not a poet." Elias nodded slowly, his heart aching with empathy for the ghost of the young girl Clara had been, and a profound appreciation for the strong woman she had become. The confession broke the final barrier of formality. They spoke of their dead loved ones, their youthful dreams, and the ways life had shattered them. The final emotional turning point arrived unexpectedly during the deepest part of the winter. Elias, checking their dwindling wood supply in the shed, slipped on a sheet of black ice, falling hard and badly, twisting his right ankle. He barely managed to crawl back to the cabin, the pain a searing, relentless fire. He, the pillar of strength, the man whose job it was to fight fire, was suddenly immobilized, completely dependent on the woman who was supposed to be his delicate charge. The injury was a perfect metaphor for his broken belief system. His strength alone was insufficient. Clara immediately took control. There was no panic, only the swift, methodical competence of a person accustomed to managing crises. She splinted his ankle with strips of flannel and cedar, her fingers firm and surprisingly gentle. She organized his care, moving him to the main room near the fire and taking on all of his outdoor chores without a single word of complaint. She became the firefighter, the trapper and the laborer. She tracked the trails, checking the snares, her substantial form moving purposefully through the heavy snow, returning hours later with game and enough wood to last the night. Elias, watching her from his cot, was overwhelmed. He wasn't seeing a mail-order bride or even a wife. He was seeing an equal, a magnificent partner whose strength was drawn not from physical size, but from sheer, unyielding will. "You should have left when you had the chance," Elias whispered one evening, his voice heavy with self-reproach, convinced he had only condemned her to a difficult rescue scenario. Clara looked at him, wiping a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "You don't understand, Elias," she said, her voice clear and without pity. "My life was never easy. I was constantly fighting. Here, yes, the work is harder, but the purpose is clear. Every log I chop, every meal I cook, every day I stay, I am building something. I am earning this life. That is more satisfying than any comfort money could buy." It was the ultimate lesson. Elias had thought he needed a woman to complete his life. He realized now he needed a partner to help him build it. His rejection of the previous women was not just about their weakness, but about his own fear. His fear of interdependence. Clara, through her steadfast refusal to leave, had taught him that true strength lies not in solitude, but in allowing oneself to rely on another. When the spring supply wagon finally arrived 3 months later, lumbering up the muddy path with old Jebediah at the reins, Elias and Clara stood on the porch. Not two individuals, but a unified, solid front. Jebediah whistled low upon seeing them. "Well, Elias," he chuckled, "looks like this one didn't run off, and you look calmer." Elias slid his arm around Clara's wide shoulders, pulling her close. "We're building something here, Jebediah. Something real." Clara, beaming, reached up to touch the weathered face of her husband. "And we're going to need more space, Jebediah," she announced, her voice ringing with quiet pride. "We're expecting a child in late summer." The news, delivered with such confident simplicity, cemented the truth of their journey. The woman who refused to leave was now the foundation of his entire future. Their love story wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a testament to enduring, practical love, a monument to shared work, honesty, and the power of finding the perfect match where one least expected it. We've reached the end of Elias and Clara's profound story, a testament to partnership built on rock-solid truth, not fragile illusions. If this journey resonated with you, and you appreciate stories that celebrate resilience and unconventional love, please consider joining our community by subscribing to the channel. We're a warm, welcoming bunch who value depth and honesty, just like Clara and Elias. We love hearing where our stories travel. In the comments below, please share which city or state you're watching from. What profound lesson did you take away from Elias and Clara's journey into true partnership?